Hey, happy Friday. Welcome back to another Friday Tech Workshop. I'm Joseph, a senior developer advocate with Appsmith. And in today's workshop, we're going to build a pivot table using a custom widget and the React pivot table library. So pivot tables, if you're not familiar with them, it's a powerful tool to explore your data. You can pick different columns and chart the data or create summary tables of totals or averages. And we're going to build that using the React pivot table library and then connect some data from Mockoon. So Mockoon is a API, mock API tool. You can connect to it and then it'll generate fake data of different types for say users or notifications. There's a to-do one, lots of different just dummy data that you can connect and use to build your app. So I'm going to feed in that data and be able to swap tables and choose which ones we're plotting and then choose a different table and just make this interactive tool that lets the end user explore any data that you pass in. So let's check it out. First, we're going to look at the docs for React Pivot Table and figure out how to get that working in a custom widget. Okay, real quick before we check out the docs for React Pivot Table, just wanted to show you what we're building today. So I've got it set up to where I can choose different data sources here, and it'll call the API again. I'm using Mockoon, which is a mock API tool. And then from whichever data source, it'll give me the column names here, and I can aggregate different things. So there's a Boolean column here to see if something's red. And we could look at the count of ones that are red or not red just by that one column, or we can compare that with something else. This data set only has one good column. It helps when there's like repeat values and all these are going to be pretty unique. So let's look at maybe to-dos. And so here we've got priority and complete. This is a little better. So let's do whether or not it's complete and then compare that with the priority. And so you can see how you can get a good breakdown from the whole data set like this. Now, Pivot Table also has some options here for a heat map. There's a few others that are built in, and then there's a whole bunch of other options if you install extra libraries and some plugins that go with this. So today we're just going to use the default ones that are included. So there's a table and a couple different heat map options here. And we're going to start out using their docs and then just get the basics working in a custom widget without connecting any data yet. And once that's working, then we can set up this dynamic data to allow the user to pick which table they want to plot data from. So first, let's check out the docs. And I'm looking at the repo here for React Pivot Table. So they have an example here, the most basic example. It's just a couple, you got to import React and React DOM, and then there's the pivot table UI, and that's it. Then you give it some kind of data, and you'll notice in this example, it's a 2D array, but more than likely you're going to want to pass an array of objects. There's a note here about seeing the docs for other supported formats, so we'll check that out in a minute. But then you just define the app with the props, and we're going to want to put some of our own data right here, along with the props that are passed in. We can add in data from the Appsmith model later. But other than that, it's just rendering it, and then whenever it changes, updating the state there. So it's a pretty simple React component, as far as being able to implement it. But what it does is really advanced. It's pretty cool what you can display with it without having to write any of that code yourself. So if we look a little further down here, talks about the data formats. And the example up there is using a 2D array like this, but we can also pass it an array of objects. So we're going to start with this example, just using our own data. And actually, we'll just leave this hard-coded at first to get it working. And then we can swap this out with our structure, which will be an array of objects. Okay, so we're going to start out with the most basic example at the top here that just has React, React DOM, and then the pivot table. Now, the first two are already installed in a custom widget by default if you choose that example, the React one. So I'm going to start a new page in the app here. and we will drag in a new custom widget. Okay, I'm going to start by dragging in a custom widget. And then we'll go to edit the source. And let's check out the example from the docs here. Going to the first example. So I'm going to copy everything except for importing React and React DOM because that's already in the code for a default custom widget just right out of the box. So if we look at the JavaScript side here, that's the first two lines. And these give you the full link to the external CDN, whereas the doc example, everything's relative as if you are bundling it. So you've got to replace all those, and it's better to just use the links that are there. So start here. Okay, so we are importing React and React DOM already. Pivot table is not actually importing. It thinks it's local and there's no like path there. There's you know, the custom widget is isolated from the rest of the app. So we have to do everything right here. So React pivot table. I'm going to import this using the ESM link here. And then for the CSS one, we'll get rid of this line. That's the pivot table CSS, and we can import that over here. So there's React pivot table. We go to the default side here. Here's the CSS link, so I'll copy that HTML. Okay, so we're getting some different errors now. It says React DOM is not defined. And it looks like right here it's calling it lowercase. Let's try this. Oh, different error now. Okay, so now that we've got links that are actually importing the things that we're trying to use here, we're getting close, but it's not quite rendering. One of the things that's complaining about here is the Appsmith on ready. So you should have an Appsmith on ready function anytime you're using a custom widget and there's anything that needs to load first. Some things will work without it, but pretty much most code you should have inside of Appsmith on ready. So this last part here where it's rendering, I'm going to cut this and put it inside an appsmith.onReady. And this takes a function as a parameter. So I'm using an arrow function. And then we'll just put that inside of it. So this is saying to render this React app on the body. We have a div here with the ID of root. So I'm just going to try to target that instead for this error. Document.get element by ID. Okay, so we're still getting an error, and I've got most of the common issues fixed. What I ended up figuring out is that the way pivot table UI is importing here, it's not exporting as a default, and so this reference here doesn't work. It sees it, it says unknown, but if you put default here, there we go. So that took a minute to figure out, and it seems like it's something to do with importing this ESM version. The rest of it was pretty straightforward just to get the basics working for it to render. So that's just the one thing I wanted to call out there. Maybe there's a better way to import this library, doing it on the HTML side or something. But the docs example and the code that actually works, that was the big difference that wasn't real straightforward for me. So I've got the library at least rendering and doing something in a custom widget. Now we want to be able to pass in our own data in place of this data and actually change that on the fly and pick a different data source and then be able to just, choose what attributes we're plotting here. So there's all these different options for, how you want to aggregate the data, and you can sort them differently here and swap around the columns at the order that you're viewing them. So it's really useful, but we need some better data. So what I'm going to do next is we're going to connect to Mockoon. Let me pull this up. So this is an API mocking tool, and they have an API playground. The main product is a tool that you can run and deploy, run it locally. They also have this API playground. So there's some free endpoints here for like different types of resources, contacts, customers, movies. So I'm going to use this endpoint. And let's go back here to the rest of the app outside of the custom widget. I'm going to add a select option up here so that you can choose what data source that you want to use. And we'll do the movies one first. So in the sample data here, it should have options that match each one. You can have a label and a value. I'm just going to hard code a couple real quick so that we have something to test with. And we'll go to create a new API. So I'm adding a blank REST API to this Mockoon address, and then we're going to reference that selected value. And so that's putting in the value movies right now. And we'll say this is called get data. So if I run that, I'm able to get back data from that one table. Now I'm going to add another couple values here in the dropdown. So we'll copy this and add dues as another one. I think contacts or customers. It might have both. I can't remember. Okay. And now when we change this option, I want to make it so that every time I change it, it calls the API again. So you can do that with the trigger. If you look down here on option change. So I'm going to have it rerun that get query, get data, every time I call the API. And I want to see the data. So let's add another table in between here, just so we can see that the API is actually running each time. Get it in between. There it is. So I'll connect this to the get data query, and that's the raw data coming back. And then below it here in the pivot table, we'll be able to analyze it. Let's make this short, just so we have a little more room. So I can change the dropdown, and it reruns the query. Now we want to pass this data into the custom widget so that we can chart that data. So if you select a custom widget, there's the default model here. Most of the code is in this source editor that we've been working in, but the default model it's just some extra stuff that you can pass in to the custom widget when it first loads. And then you can modify that model from inside the custom widget and outside. But this just defines its initial state. So when the custom widget first loads up, I want to pass in some data, and I'll call it raw data because this is before we have charted anything or put it through the pivot table. And then we'll take this from getData.data. So I'm sending in an object with a property of raw data. And now back in the custom widget. So next, instead of using the data that's up here and hard-coded, I want to pass it into the state and get it as part of the props right here. So I'm going to put an object around this, and we want to add some extra properties to go with it. So I'm using the spread operator on the props here, and at this point it's pretty much the same thing it was a minute ago, just an object that's spread out into a separate object, but this lets you add some more data to it. In this case, it's going to be called data. So I'm going to bind that to the Appsmith.model raw data. There we go. There's the column headers. So it's seeing that data now. Okay, so it's definitely seeing the data because it's got the column names. But when I comment this data out, see, I'm getting this reference error, data is not defined. So it's not using this data right here because that's the column headers from my API, but I'm still getting that error, and that is this reference right here. So at this point, I've already passed in the data I want to use into the state. I think I can just get rid of this line, and let's make sure that it's still able to see the data. Yeah, it's charting. Cool. So the first thing was pulling in data from the model and then merging that in using the spread operator and another object here so that the example from the docs that's just shows where to set the state to the props. I'm just merging in my data with that. And then since this was being referenced here, it looks like just commenting that out, or we can delete this line, is going to avoid that reference where it was defined externally here. So now it's right there inside the state. So we can get rid of that. And it looks like we don't have any errors. It's able to see the data outside. Let's see what happens when we change the API now, because I don't think we've got it set up to respond to model changes yet. So the raw data is updating and the API is running, but this custom widget is not responding to changes in the model. So we got most of it working. The last thing is to tell the custom widget to re-render whenever there's a change to the model. So let's go back to our custom widget. Got to select it. All right, we have, here's where it's defined in the constructor. And then here it's rendering it. I think inside of this, right here, we wanted to do one to update it. So right here, I need a function to run to define that on model change behavior, the thing that I want this component to do when the Appsmith model changes. And in React, there's this component did mount. This will get invoked right after the component is mounted. So Appsmith has its own on-model update, and in React, there's this kind of equivalent component did mount. So I'm going to use this function to define what the Appsmith model should trigger. So calling my function component did mount, and that'll tell React what to do. And then inside of here, it's the Appsmith on-model change. And that takes a function as a parameter. So then inside of here, I just want to update the state again. And to do that, we will use the model. On model change, it'll pass in that model. And then we'll use that to set this dot set state to an object, which has a data property and that same model dot raw data. So the model here that we're starting with is coming from the Appsmith model, where we're passing in the raw data. And then as the component's changing and updating, anytime it changes, it will take that model and just update the data. I think that might work. Let's test it one more time. There it is. So the column names down here changed now. And if I select a different table, it reruns the API and then regenerates the columns here. So I think we got everything working now. We're able to dynamically pass in different data. And then once you've got that data, let me go to preview mode here. So we can pick, let's look at the count of genres, or we might want to compare that against the rating. And, you could even do like averages or switch which axis you're putting these on, and then go to the next data source. So you could easily build this with SQL as well for a data source. I'm using an API, but you could use prepared statements. If you turn that off, you can pass in dynamic values and say, grab this table, now grab this table. So You want to be careful with that when you turn off prepared statements because of SQL injection. But if it's a dropdown and the user can only select that dropdown, that could be a way to get the same functionality out of SQL, basically. So you just want some kind of trigger to keep rerunning the same query, or you'd have to maybe write some logic that writes a bunch of different queries and use some condition. But basically, you pass in your data dynamically, and then the user can just drag around columns now and create these types of reports. There's all the different aggregate options here. So you can do average or total or min, max. And then there's the different types of tables. There's just the standard table or some heat maps. So lots of cool options here. I hope this has been helpful. If you have any ideas for future workshops or any questions on this one, feel free to drop a comment below. Thanks again for watching, and we will see you next week.